So the luncheon presentation is going to be a couple of recent papers that have been developed at the Cook Center that have been generated out of the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color project. The National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color was motivated by the desire to get information on the wealth position of specific national origin communities. Now, if you look at the typical national data set, you can get information about Hispanics, non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks. These are the categories that are customary. You also will have some data sets that will include Asians, but the numbers are typically relatively small, and usually people don't attempt to make any significant inferences out of them. And if we think of the major data sets like the Survey of Consumer Finances that have information about people's net worth, it's virtually impossible to say anything substantive about the Asian respondents' net worth position. So we were charged with, this is around 2013, 2014, with the development of a new survey instrument that would allow us to look at specific national origin communities. So in the case of thinking about Asians, we wanted to look specifically at groups like individuals who were of Chinese ancestry, Japanese ancestry, Filipino ancestry, Hmong ancestry. In the case of Hispanics, we wanted to be able to look specifically at Dominicans or Mexicans or Cubans or Puerto Ricans. Non-Hispanic blacks, we wanted to be able to make a distinction between the group that we sometimes refer to as native blacks, as well as blacks who are of more recent immigrant status in the United States. And with respect to non-Hispanic whites, we wanted to be able to address their ethnic origins as well. And I have to confess that we have not exploited the ethnic variation among whites as substantively as we have exploited the information that we've had about the other groups that are hyper-aggregated. We identified a set of cities that would allow us to dig down and look at these specific national origin communities. And the initial phase of the project was a series of phone surveys that were conducted in Boston, Los Angeles, Miami, the District of Columbia, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I think the Boston study is the one that's most famous, because there's a notorious statistic that people frequently quote, and I usually sit there in some amusement since I know where the statistic came from. But people frequently refer to median black wealth in the Boston metropolitan area as $8. That's not 800, that's not 80, that's $8. The studies, the 5 initial city studies were supported primarily by the Ford Foundation. In the case of the Boston study, there was a collaboration with the Boston Fed. In the case of the Los Angeles phone survey, there was a collaboration with the San Francisco Fed. And with respect to the Washington, D.C. survey, there was a collaboration with the Urban Institute. And up to this point, up until today, there have been 4 major studies that have been released. The first is known as The Color of Wealth in Boston. The second, The Color of Wealth in Los Angeles. The third, The Color of Wealth in Miami. And then the fourth we call The Color of Wealth in the nation's capital. But today, there are going to be 2 presentations that represent significant extensions upon the original 5 cities that were examined. And I'll have to say, we chose Tulsa, Oklahoma because we wanted to be able to get detailed information about the Native American population in the United States, and we have not issued the Tulsa report yet. But the 2 presentations today are going to be based first on a second survey that was conducted in Los Angeles, a face-to-face survey, which enabled us to gather information about, I'm getting a signal to take my hat off. My head was nice and warm, but all right. Okay, thank you for the signal. Okay. The second survey was was based upon a series of face-to-face interviews that were performed in Los Angeles that enabled us to get information about the phenotypical characteristics of the respondents. So interviewers were asked to rate the respondents to the face-to-face survey on the basis of their skin shade and on the basis of their attractiveness. Now, one of the things that's also particularly unique about this survey is we actually asked the respondents if we could take their photographs, and half of them agreed. But we have not fully exploited the photo portion of the sample yet. And in the study here today, the focus is going to be on the interviewer ratings of the individual's appearance. In addition, there's going to be a presentation on the sixth city that has been brought into play in the National Asset Scorecard of Communities of Color Studies, Baltimore, Maryland, which is a survey that includes detailed information about the incarceration experiences of the households whose heads were interviewed. And this particular study was funded not only by the Ford Foundation, but also by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And as an addendum to that study, in this case it's somewhat of an addendum, we actually did a second round of interviews with individuals trying to get information about their credit scores. And as you might anticipate, a significant number of the respondents were reluctant to give us that information, but some of them did, and Monica Garcia Perez is going to give a presentation on the results of that particular survey. But in the present moment, the team members that have been the folks who have done the dedicated work on the two projects that I just mentioned, the second survey in Los Angeles, the sixth city survey in Baltimore, that team is going to do a succession of presentations today. Rafi Emmanuel Garcia, Jorge Zumaeta, Lauren Russell, and Aaron Colston. Rafi and Jorge are both DITE fellows, alums of the DITE program. But I think Lauren, who I anticipate may be a DITE fellow in the near future, is going to open the presentation. So there you go.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Russell, and I'm a new research associate at the Cook Center, and I'm also a current PhD student in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm really excited to share with you all today a new report built in collaboration with Rafi Garcia, Jorge Zumaeta, and Aaron Colston in Sandy Darity. This project is titled Race, Phenotype, and Economic Disparities, Evidence from Los Angeles. All right. So, as Sandy mentioned, this report builds on the initial Color of Wealth Los Angeles report made in 2016. In that report, they used telephone survey data from the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color. And in that survey, they collected very detailed information on the income, earnings, assets, and debts for various racial ethnic groups. And the explicit purpose of that report was to explore the wealth inequality and economic inclusion across racial and ethnic groups in Los Angeles. It's really important to highlight, as Sandy mentioned earlier, that the original Color of Wealth uses very precise definitions of racial ethnic groups. So as opposed to like the broadly defined Asian category, the report disaggregates results by Japanese individuals, Chinese individuals, Vietnamese individuals, etc. Instead of the broad racial group of Black, the report disaggregates information by nativity. So we have US Blacks who were born to other US Blacks, and we also have African Blacks who have a more recent generational immigration history. In that same vein, instead of the Hispanic category that we typically see, the report disaggregates results by Mexicans, which is the largest Hispanic ethnic group in Los Angeles, and a separate group for other Hispanics, which they pool together because the sample sizes are small for those groups. In that report, they found significant wealth gaps across these various racial ethnic groups, with US Blacks and Mexican households having the lowest net worths, and with Japanese, Asian, Indian, Chinese, and white households having the highest net worths. So in this report, what we're going to do is we're going to explicitly study the relationship between skin tone, physical attractiveness ratings or perceived physical attractiveness, and socioeconomic outcomes within and across these racial ethnic groups in Los Angeles. And we're going to use this novel face-to-face interview survey data from the NASC. All right. So we already know that there are substantial racial disparities in income and wealth in the United States. This is something that we see in the original Color Wealth reports and a host of other economic reports. We also know from research that there's this robust empirical relationship between skin complexion, physical attractiveness, labor market outcomes, and health outcomes. We find that it has been found that lighter complexion individuals tend to earn more on average and are more likely to be employed in white-collar jobs. And we also have seen in research that physical attractiveness pays across a host of different dimensions, including labor markets, datings, and various types of social interactions. So that body of research really emphasizes the importance of studying complexion and attractiveness as potential drivers of racial and interracial inequality. This is really important when we consider the potential differences in the racial and gender distribution of skin complexion and perceived attractiveness. A paper from 2021 by Monk finds that there is an equal, in a report where they analyze interviewer ratings of attractiveness, they find that there's an equal distribution of interviewer rated attractiveness for men, but that there's a different distribution for white, Black, and Hispanic women. And so you want to think about how this differing distribution can also potentially contribute to differences in racial and interracial inequality. So what we're going to do here is, like I said earlier, we're going to explicitly study these gaps in wealth, earnings, and health across all of the racial ethnic groups in our face-to-face sample, and we're also going to study these gaps within race by complexion groups. And in order to do that, actually, I'll hold that last part for later. I'll tell you how we're going to do it later when we get to the methodology. But one thing that we're also going to do here, similar to the Color of Wealth report, is that we're going to study very precise racial ethnic groups. So here we're going to study US Blacks, African Blacks, Mexicans, Koreans, and Cambodians, as opposed to the general categories of Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians that we typically see in this type of research. So why Los Angeles? Well, we study Los Angeles because it's the second largest city in the United States, and there is significant ethnic and racial diversity in Los Angeles. So this really gives us the opportunity to really take a peek at all the different financial portfolios across a variety of racial and ethnic groups, just because of the size and the ethnic diversity of Los Angeles. So before I dive into slides that just show numbers after numbers after numbers, I'm going to do a quick preview of the findings to help ground us before we get into the tables. So what we find in this study is that across African American, Korean, and Cambodian participants, we do find that lighter skin tone seems to be correlated with more favorable economic and social outcomes. We find an opposite pattern within the Mexican community, which we'll talk about later as potentially why that might exist. We do find a positive correlation between attractiveness, earnings, and wealth, but that correlation is not statistically significant. And then we look at a few different decompositions, which I'll explain in a moment. And what we find from those is that we do find significant differences in the self-reported health for Koreans and Cambodians compared to whites. And we find that when we look within race, we find a health gap for Mexicans, so for light-skinned Mexicans versus non-light-skinned Mexicans. All right. So how are we going to do all of this, and what type of data are we going to use? So as mentioned before, we're using the NASC face-to-face survey data, which utilizes in-person interviews. And so in this survey, interviewers collect really detailed earnings, income, asset, and debt information that fully captures the financial resources at the household level for all of these survey participants. The asset and debt questions were intentionally written to replicate questions from the panel study of income dynamics. And so I don't include a table of this in this presentation, but if you look at the report that you guys received yesterday, you can see a breakdown of all the different asset and debt values across the various racial and ethnic groups. The survey also includes a multitude of racial and ethnic groups. So we have US Blacks, African Blacks, Mexicans, Cambodians, Koreans, other Hispanics, and whites. And then as mentioned earlier too, one really unique aspect of this data is that at the end of the survey, so after the interviewers have collected all of this financial information for each household, they're then tasked with two things. One is to rate each survey respondent on their level of physical attractiveness on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very unattractive and 5 being very attractive. And then they're also asked to rate the respondent's skin tone. And so in order to rate the skin tone, each interviewer is given the scale pictured of above, and they're asked to pick the number that best matches the participant's skin tone. Right. Then at the very end of all of this, they can ask each respondent if they would like to have their picture taken. Some respondents consented, some didn't. And so we also have a data set that includes all of those pictures, but we did not use any of the pictures for this study, but it is a great opportunity for future research. All right. So we go about this in two ways. So first, we start with some very simple OLS linear regressions, where we look at the relationship between skin complexion, attractiveness, and earnings. And then secondly, we use something called the Blinder-Oaxaca decomposition, which is going to allow us to study mean outcome differences between groups. And so the way this works is that we're going to decompose the mean difference between groups into two different components, right? We're going to decompose it into one component that can be explained by observable differences in control variables. And so the control variables that we include in these regressions are age, education, and gender. And there's another component that cannot be explained by these covariates. The unexplained component can be attributed to unobservable characteristics across racial ethnic groups, of which potential discrimination across various markets is one of those potential explanations. In order to do the within race decompositions, we have to classify survey respondents into a binary category for light complexion versus non-light complexion. And we do that based on that 10-point scale, based on with the pictures of the various skin tones, where the threshold for light skin complexion is going to differ across the different racial groups and was selected by analyzing the distribution of complexion scores within each race. All right, so first let's get into who's in the sample and what's in the sample. So here, this is a table where we just report means and standard deviations of some key variables that you'll see throughout our analysis. And so I'm going to focus now on the earnings and wealth and the health estimates that we have here based on our sample, which are, the rankings are in line with the Color of Wealth LA, the original Color of Wealth LA report. So what we find here is that whites are the groups with the highest average household income and wealth. We find that in terms of income, Black Africans are the group in the sample with the second highest income, followed by Koreans. We find that Koreans form the group with the second highest wealth value, followed by Black Africans. And we find that other Hispanics and US Blacks are the groups with the lowest levels of income and wealth. In terms of self-reported health, we find that African Blacks have the highest self-reported health, followed by US Blacks, then whites, Mexicans, other Hispanics, Koreans, and Cambodians. And I don't think I mentioned it before, but I mentioned how physical attractiveness was rated on a scale of 1 to 5. Self-reported health is also measured on a scale of 1 to 5, where a score of 1 means very excellent health, and a score of 5 means poor health. So the higher the score, the worse the self-reported health is. All right. Another thing to note here is that we have a net worth value here, which we calculated. And so household net worth is just calculated by subtracting the total amount of debts reported from the total number of assets. And so in a little bit, I'll get a bit into how we calculated all the debts and assets. And like I said before, you can see it in the report that we produced. So the next thing that we look at is we look at the distribution of interviewer-rated skin tone and physical attractiveness measures across our various racial ethnic groups. And what we find is that, most whites have a skin tone rating of 1 or 2, which makes sense. In contrast, we find that US Blacks tend to have a broader range of skin tones from 2 to 10, with most falling in that 4 to 7 range, We also find that African Blacks also have a wider range of 3 to 9, with most falling between the 6 to 8 range. While Mexicans and other Hispanics tend to fall into the lighter skin tone range, ranging from 1 to 5, with a 3 as the median rating. So we did have one surpriser, which was for Koreans. We found that the median rating was a 4, which is not exactly what we suspected, but it is what we found. And we also found that Cambodians have a very similar distribution to Mexicans and other Hispanics in terms of their skin tone ranges. So in the second two tables, we take a look at physical attractiveness. So in this data, we find that the attractiveness rating distribution tends to be skewed towards lighter skin tones. So with the skin tones who receive a score of 3 or lower, receiving 59% of the attractive and very attractive ratings. All right. So the next thing we do with this data is we take a look at some correlations. And so we look at the linear correlation between skin tone and a perceived attractiveness. And so first we start by looking at the full sample, and then after we look at the full sample, we look within each racial ethnic group. And what we find in the full sample, which is pooled across all the racial ethnic groups, is that we find a correlation of negative 0.068, which is not a particularly strong correlation, but it does show that there is this tendency to associate lighter skin tones with higher levels of physical attractiveness. Now, when we look within the racial ethnic groups, we do find stronger correlations for some of these groups, we do find stronger correlations within some of these groups, all mirroring the same pattern of lighter individuals being perceived as more attractive. We find the strongest correlations for whites, other Hispanics, Koreans, Mexicans, and US Blacks. All right. So this is what we did to look at the relationship between perceived physical attractiveness, skin tone, and our outcome of interest, which is here log earnings, using some OLS regressions. And so we start with regressions in column 1 and 2 that are very simple, that just look at a regression of skin tone and physical attractiveness ratings on log earnings. What we find here is that skin tone does have a statistically significant negative relationship with log earnings, implying that darker skin tones are associated with lower earnings. In columns 3 through 4, we add controls for the different racial ethnic groups, and in one of those columns, we also add interviewer fixed effects, so column 4. What we find here is that all of the racial ethnic group, or all of the coefficients on the racial ethnic groups, except for the African Black racial group, have negative and statistically significant coefficients, which means that they all have lower average earnings when compared to whites. And we also notice that we've lost the significance on our skin tone coefficient, which is evidence that race or racial ethnic groups might be absorbing some of the effects away from skin tone. As we progress throughout the columns, we add more controls for gender, age, educational level, and nativity, so whether or not someone was born in the US or not. And then in columns 7 through 8, we add an interaction term between attractiveness and complexion to test for a difference in the potential return to complexion based on attractiveness or vice versa. Column 7, the coefficient on complexion is negative and statistically significant at the 10% level, and the coefficient on the interaction term is positive and statistically significant, which implies that it might be the case that attractiveness might mitigate the potential penalty of darker skin tones. But then when we add interviewer fixed effects in the last column, we lose our significance on that interaction term. And so it might be that once we control for interviewer biases, that effect goes away. So we can dig a little bit more into that. So now what we do, and in the next grouping of slides, what we look at are the decomposition results for earnings, net worth, and health. And so these decompositions are going to give us the mean difference in these outcomes, so the mean difference in earnings, net worth, and health across these various racial ethnic groups, where in these tables, in the tables that do the across racial group decompositions, group 1 is always going to denote white households, and group 2 is going to denote the minority, racial, or ethnic group of interest. And so if you see a positive difference, that means that the average outcomes for whites was higher than that for the comparison racial ethnic group. So what we find here when we look at the decomposition for earnings is we do find substantial racial differences in average earnings for the majority of the racial ethnic groups. So we find that the gap in average 2014 earnings between whites and US blacks is a little over $23,000, with only 31% of this gap being explained by group differences in age, education, and gender. For African blacks, the income gap is $9,600, but it's not statistically significant. For Mexicans, the gap is a little over $25,000, with 55% of this gap unexplained by the control variables that we include. And we find a similar gap for other Hispanics. For Koreans, the gap is $19,000. But notice for Koreans, 96% of this gap cannot be explained by differences in gender, education, and age. For Cambodians, we find that the gap is a little over $24,000, with 59% of the gap explained. And so when we compare the percentage of the earnings gap that is unexplained, we see that Koreans seem to be facing the most potential discrimination, followed by US blacks, Cambodians, and Hispanics. Right. And I do want to note that it is beyond the scope of this report to determine causal effects. So what we're talking about now are just associations. Yeah. All right. So now we look at this same decomposition, but within race. And so now we're going to look at it light complexion individuals compared to non-light complexion individuals within each different racial ethnic group. And so here, group 1 is always going to denote individuals with lighter skin tones, and group 2 is going to denote everyone else in the racial ethnic group. Okay. And I should also note that we only do this analysis for US blacks, Mexicans, and Koreans because of small sample sizes. And also for some of the groups, there's like limited skin shade variation, so we're not able to do much there. What we find here is that US blacks, we find a skin shade income gap of $11,280, with lighter complexion individuals earning more than darker complexion individuals. And we find that 88% of this gap is unexplained and statistically significant, which is potential evidence of colorism in labor markets. We observe an opposite pattern for Mexicans, Koreans, and Cambodians, where in these racial ethnic groups, darker complexion individuals seem to be out-earning lighter complexion counterparts. However, only the skin shade income gap is statistically significant for Mexicans at a 90% level, but not for Koreans and Cambodians. So. We next perform the same set of decompositions, but for the wealth gap. And so the wealth variable here is measured as total household net worth. And as mentioned before, it's just calculated from subtracting the total number of debts reported at the household level from the total number of assets. And so the value of total assets include things like home equity, other real estate, vehicle equity, business equity, money in checking and savings accounts, stock portfolios, et cetera. And total debt is going to include information like debt from credit cards, installment loans, student loans, medical bills, all of that. I also want to note that for the wealth gap decompositions, we're working with a much, much smaller sample size. So we're working with about 335 observations as opposed to the 506 that we were working with earlier. And we also use normalized wealth in this decomposition. And so the units for these coefficients are going to be in standard deviations. So if we look at the results of this decomposition, what we find is we do find substantial differences in the average net worth across races, which is in line with the original Color of Wealth report. We find that the difference between the average wealth of whites and US blacks is about 0.8 standard deviations, with 44% of this gap explained by differences in age, gender, and education level. And we also included marital status here. I didn't type that on the slide, but we did include marital status. On the other hand, for African blacks and Mexicans, the majority of the gap can be explained by differences in the covariates that we include. So for African blacks, the gap is 0.67 standard deviations, where 99.9% of that gap can be explained by differences in the covariates that we include. For Mexicans, the gap is 0.78, with 96.8% of that gap that's explained by differences in the covariates. For Koreans, the wealth gap is 0.63 standard deviations. However, differences in education, age, gender, and marital status here actually reduce the explained wealth gap in favor of Koreans as compared to white households by 55%. But in comparison, the unexplained portion is 155% higher. And so this shows that there might be significant discrimination against Koreans in labor markets. For Cambodians, we find that the gap is 0.79 standard deviations, where about half or a little over half of this gap can be explained by differences in these observables. And then finally, in terms of wealth, we do this decomposition by skin tone. And so given the very limited number of observations for some of the groups, here we are only able to perform decompositions for US Blacks, Koreans, and Cambodians. All right. So here are the results of these decompositions for net worth. So for US Blacks, we find a wealth gap of about 0.02 standard deviations, with lighter complexion individuals having higher net worth than their darker complexion counterparts. However, this wealth gap is not statistically significant. And we find similar results for Koreans and Cambodians, but those results are also not statistically significant. And so for our final set of decompositions, we turn to looking at self-reported health. So first, we're going to look at the across racial ethnic group comparison. So once again, the base group of comparison is white households or white survey respondents. And so what we find here is that we find that there is a statistically significant difference in self-reported health only for Koreans and Cambodians. So we find that on average, Koreans report a health score of 0.5 points higher than whites, primarily due to unexplained factors. In comparison, Cambodians report a score of a little over a point higher than whites, with an equal or almost equal combination of explained and unexplained factors. And then we look at the same health gap, but now decomposed within race by complexion. And we only find significant differences in self-reported health for Mexicans. On average, lighter complexion Mexicans report a health score that's 0.59 points higher than darker complexion Mexicans. Although these estimates are not statistically significant, we do observe a similar pattern for US Blacks and Cambodians, with lighter complexion individuals reporting better health. Koreans seem to be displaying an opposite pattern, with darker complexion Koreans having a health score on average of 0.15 points higher. And so what does all of this mean? So in conclusion, this study is really building on that initial Color of Wealth Los Angeles report by exploring this relationship between skin tone, attractiveness, and earnings with wealth and health also. And what we do find is that darker skin tones do seem to be associated with lower earnings for African Americans or US Blacks in this survey. While that was not necessarily the case for Mexicans, Koreans, and Cambodians, this finding has a lot of implications for implicit bias theory, labor market analysis, human capital literature, et cetera. We also find for earnings, unlike the measure of wealth, where earnings was only asked of the household head or the survey respondent, so we do find that the differences that we find in earnings do provide a more direct assessment of the implication of skin color and attractiveness on financial incomes than does the measure of wealth, which is asked about the entire household. We do not find a statistically significant relationship between skin tone and wealth in this report, but there could be a lot of different reasons for this. One very big one is the very small subgroup sample sizes that we have. There could also be, differences in like household risk appetites or household composition that could be influencing this too. So our big conclusion is that we definitely find this connection between skin tone and financial outcomes, and that some economic outcomes like earnings seem to be more connected to appearances than others. And so this analysis really serves to just highlight the importance of collecting this type of data in addition to data on assets and debts when looking at disparities in economic and social outcomes. And it also highlights the importance of collecting information that gives very precise racial ethnic group information too. All right. So I guess I'll take a few questions now, and then, oh, okay. I think I saw your hand go up first. Oh, is there a?
I see that you distinguish between U.S. blacks and African blacks, but what about Caribbean blacks? Don't you think that it would make sense, particularly for LA?
Yeah, no, it would absolutely make sense. We just don't have that in our survey, but that's a very valid point. Yeah, it would be great to expand the number of ethnic groups that we have within each racial category. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so now I'm just looking at your result on no significance between skin tone and wealth. One thing that might be worth an effort is to look at, it could be heterogeneity, quantile effects. Now that being said, I'm not quite sure how one decomposes quantile effects across the distribution, but there could be heterogeneity at the lower, middle, or top end, so quantile effects with respect to skin tone and wealth. Just as
Okay, thank
might
you.
be worth looking at.
Yeah, thank you. I think I saw you, and then I'll come to you in the green blouse.
I may have missed what you're doing with gender, but I was wondering if the effect of skin color differed for men and women, if you have any information on that.
Right, so we didn't focus on gender in this report because we were already working with very, very small sample sizes. But you're absolutely right in that if we had a larger sample size, it would be very important to also look at gender differences.
So, to Guy's point about disaggregating into smaller groups, when you think about many of the international populations that I guess are represented in your sample, even if you disaggregate them and then you only do like African blacks and then non-African blacks, I guess is what the other category was. You could do that for the other groups, and I'm thinking it's important, especially for like where you're looking at Koreans, right? I'm thinking about when I'm in Jonesboro and I meet somebody who is Korean, but they have the same Southern drawl as me and the same, you know, like they grew up here.
Right.
And so that disaggregation might change that outlier for maybe Koreans, maybe everybody else, but you have that same dynamic in other ethnicities as well.
Right. No, yeah, I also agree with that. And it kind of boils down to the same thing. If we're able to ever expand the number of face-to-face interviews, then we'll be able to get a lot more granular with the different categories that we're able to look at. Yep.
On that note, one suggestion would be, even if you expand the categories, you might, you might want to look at generation status,
Right.
as an additional, like, you know, stratifier to kind of explain. Because I think it might be interesting to look at the distribution of skin tone by generation status.
Oh, that would be interesting.
On this question as well. So.
Okay, thank you.
Does that age? Like, you include age.
We do include age, but it's, I think it's something slightly, yeah. I guess I'll turn it over to, there's one more question? Oh, sorry, I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's fine. So, I think it's 2 in 1. So one would be what may be the policy implication for this, and secondly, being an African black, I think sometimes maybe what brings us here could also affect the income level, because most of us are here for school. And I could tell you that there's a big difference between those who came here with green cards and those who came here on a visa status. Because those who came here on a green card already get jobs, and so they work. But those of us who came here on a visa status, you know that, no, I have to get my education and then get, you know, my green card, and then I work. So that could also affect the results of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I think we'll take one more question, and then I'll turn it over to Jorge so we can get in the Baltimore report too. Yeah, we'll take one more question.
So I was going to make that generational comment. I know you have really small groups, really super interesting work. So how did you define them? Are they defining themselves?
Yeah.
They're defining themselves, and so, because I know you have the US blacks and the African blacks, and you had this control for born in the US though, right? So for the US blacks, then you're asking them, are you a descendant of US blacks?
Oh,
No.
I'll let Professor Darity answer that question since he was.
Okay, so you don't ask them if they're, so how do they get defined into the US blacks?
No, that's a great question. No, an individual self-reports their ancestry, their specific, the country that they identify as their family's country of origin. And so to the extent that somebody might say Nigeria, we would put them in the African black category. So that's how that works, yeah. There was something else I wanted to say. Yes, we can do that. Yeah, we can look at the racial characteristics of the interviewers also.
The interviewer fixed the best advice, that was really good.
Yeah.
We felt that, but just finding more about the match, more descriptives about how.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. There was the previous question. I had a comment on.
Did it slip your mind?
I can't remember what the previous question was. I'm sorry.
Was it about the generational?
Oh, the intergenerational effects? The visa versus green card. I just wanted to say that the results that we get in some of these studies are specific to particular cities, and they don't carry over to others.
Yeah.
So in the case of Washington, D.C., the African blacks, who I presume are disproportionately from East Africa, in contrast with the LA blacks, who are probably disproportionately from West Africa, we find that actually the levels of wealth are extremely low for blacks who are based in Washington, D.C., in contrast with the African black population in Los Angeles. And so there's a geographic or spatial consideration that has to be taken into account. And we're not fully able yet to explain why we find these differences, but they are very much present. And I just wanted to add that the largest Asian groups in our sample are Chinese and Japanese, but we didn't include them in the colorism analysis because their color variation based upon the interviewer's classification is relatively flat, right? So, yeah.
Thank you. I think due to time, I have to turn it over to Jorge. However, if we have time at the end, I'll answer any more questions.
While Jorge's setting up, I just want to explain also a little bit the results that we obtained from the Mexicans.
Oh, Rafi, kick
Sorry.
off the...
So I just want to also explain the results that we obtained as we've actually found that black Mexicans ended up having higher wealth, and it is due to the actual immigration when they work in the context of LA. A lot of black Mexicans were already existed there, that lived there before. So they had, in a sense, they have higher wealth because they've been in the U.S. longer, and that's why why we were able to tie to that nation.
One more question on this side. And
Well, self-employed, do you have an estimate of their value of their business, or what do you do with that?
So we include business equity as one of the asset values. So in the actual color wealth physical report. Oh.
microphone, please. Right here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so we do include business equity in the assets category. And if you look in the printed color wealth report, you can see a detailed racial ethnic breakdown of all asset and debt categories.
Awesome. Awesome presentation. Very difficult to follow that up, after a wonderful presentation done by Lauren. My name is Jorge Sumaeta. I'm originally from Peru, but live in Miami for the longest. And I'm part of this team that put together these research reports for you. I want to thank the Cook Center and Duke for allowing me this opportunity and for allowing me the opportunity to exchange ideas with you. and educate me and try to take this research to a higher level in a way that allowed the unheard voices to be part of future policies. And that's kind of my role, not just as a researcher, but as a person with a heart that is attempting to change the many realities that we are facing, not just across America, but across the world, because we set the tone for many parts of the world, and whatever we do here can be replicated elsewhere. And with that, let's start with our Color of Wealth of Baltimore. Baltimore has many characteristics that makes it very enticing to do research. No? One of them is for sure the diversity that has in its population, but also the historical aspects of it. And I will bring one of my associates to elaborate on it a little bit more. But prior to that, let me find the clicker. This shouldn't be difficult. Oh, I just killed the presentation. Okay, so Professor Doherty worked on this, expanded on what this NASC survey is, the studies and so forth, and the different cities that have been part of this study. So I'm just going to move forward due to the time, because our presentation has been turned into a 20-minute presentation that hopefully we can accommodate some Q&As at the beginning. As you can tell by now, I'm escape a little bit the academic discourse, and I venture a little more into practitioner due to the fact of my bringing as an economist for the Department of Labor. And with that, I commend the person that brought up a question in the prior session where they were asking, what is in it for ultimately, ultimately after we do all this research, how do we impact society and our community? So the two research questions we're focusing with this, that we focus on this report and this research, is what are the factors influencing racial differences in asset and debt accumulation, household income, intergenerational asset transfer, and household net worth across the city of Baltimore. Once again, primarily because Baltimore could be used as a good sample for the rest of the nation in terms of the dynamics that goes, the racial dynamics between blacks, African Americans, and whites. The second question is, what is the impact of household exposure to incarceration on household income and wealth accumulation? Knowing that the African Americans, the black Americans, are mostly impacted negatively by the different systemic challenges that our judicial system have, and unfortunately impacts the African American community in a different way to other segments of the population. This is, why do we want to study incarceration? Why do we want to study the impact of incarceration on the household, not just on the individual, but on the household? What does it mean to have a father and mother absent, or a member of the family absent due to incarceration? What's the immediate impact and the long-lasting impact? Don't forget, in the prior question, when we were looking at the research questions, we were talking about also intergenerational wealth. So obviously, when you start looking at the removal of one member of the family, a family member from the nuclear family, obviously it's going to have an impact. But are we talking, how do we put this in terms of policy making when we're trying to impact a specific segment of the population by energizing or creating programs or intervening, when we know that the damage that we are causing, or the bias system is causing on the families, are long-lasting beyond 1 or 2, 3 generations. So you can see, what you see there is that the city of Baltimore really gets impacted 2 times, 3 times in terms of the incarceration rate when you compare it to Maryland or when you compare it to the US. Is a statistic that needs to be brought up to the attention of our elected officials over and over again, because this needs to be tackled, this needs to be dealt with. Looking at, once again, this is in terms of jail population, and when you compare, and this is for Maryland, and comparing blacks and whites, and you can see that the blue line is the African American, is significantly much higher than the orange line that you see at the bottom, which is relatively flat. And yes, towards, after 2015, there was a slight decline, but you can see that it's back up again in 2017 and so forth. Then how all this incarceration exposure to the household impacts real median household income by race and ethnicity is what you see there. But then once again, you see the dramatic, very significant differences between the different racial groups. So this is something that once again needs a lot of attention. This doesn't come to surprise to anybody in the room. Having said that, what else, what other statistics, what other knowledge are we adding, contributing with this, generating through this research, and how can we tackle these issues? So before I keep going, I'm gonna bring our historian, and this came as another research in terms of the geographical distancing between the history department at Duke and the economic department at Duke. So in order to close that gap, we needed to include a historian to keep us in check. I'm talking about keep the research team in check. So let me welcome Aaron Colton to bring a very specific historical perspective on Baltimore.
Everyone, thank you very much. It has been a real pleasure as an observer participant on this project. I always like to think of the role of the historian in these sorts of projects as an auxiliary support and cheerleader. At times, much of the perspective I brought were very, very, very historical. For instance, why are we talking about the 17th century? Well, anyway. Here's a leap. Don't worry, I'm not starting with the 17th century. I had actually sat with this project for quite some time. It was first introduced to me when I was a graduate student at Duke, and I'm glad to see it come to completion, especially because it initially began under the concerns over Freddie Gray. It seems we are back in that moment. Freddie Gray's death in police custody raised a series of moral crises that had been all, I think, well familiar to us. And so the collection of this data on incarceration and the wealth gap, of course, was in response to that. And so here we are landing on the other side of George Floyd's murder. Of course, the broader interest is moving away from the particular locus of carceral violence, in terms of a particular body that has been terminated in police custody, and more towards a general structure of a carceral economy on which this kinds of violence depends. And one of the challenges for us as a team is that the major paradigm for this is built on a completely different state, that is California. I think you all are familiar in some form or capacity with Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag, right? It's a fantastic and rather challenging study about how the state builds itself through a carceral economy by resolving all these particular kinds of crises with building a prison system. And where Maryland comes in the historical picture is that this kind of pattern has been observed for a very long time. For instance, Alexis de Tocqueville, the great writer of French nobility who visits the United States in the 19th century, observed that Americans always build new prisons and leave the old ones in disrepair. So even in the 1830s. So it's not the 17th century, but it's pretty recent. In any case, one of the major shifts that brings us closer to this data set that we'll be getting into is the transition from the detention of slave and free labor of the 19th century to the targeted industrial economy focused in shipyards and rails on which black Americans were largely on the periphery. One thing that should trouble us somewhat is the carceral subjects tend to not get as much attention. That what's really fascinating is that in the 19th century, a person like Frederick Douglass observes that actually slaves were far freer than incarcerated persons. At least in cities, slaves are active participants in the industrial economy, and as it evolves, the distinction between free and slave labor begins to dissolve. On the other side of the Civil War, the main concern begins to be as the economy of Baltimore finds its place within a national economy, it again finds itself on a periphery, such that the kinds of economic opportunities for wealth building become curtailed. When we start to look into the 20th century, the patterns that I think are especially familiar to us start to manifest. A particular vision for progressive reform in the prison system continues to expose itself as rather incomplete, if not deceptive, in that a great deal of how the prison system in America had been formed was really to monitor folks on the periphery. And the upshot of all of this leads us to where we are today, which is the higher rates of both incarceration in the African American community, as well as the gaps in wealth. Certain kinds of cyclical patterns keep emerging, and because of all of this, I very much encourage your attention to the rest of the presentation, and down the line, if you'd like more insight from the 17th century to the present, we can hash it out. Thank you very much, Jorge.
Thank you, Aaron. As you can see, beyond the descriptive statistics, the regressions, the discompositions, there is more to it. There is soul, there is passion, there is really the willingness to engage in meaningful research that impact changes our communities. For us, for our kids, for future generations. And my apologies. Sometimes I sound like an elected official, but for sure I'm not attending to. But it touches the heart when we look at these numbers. So our findings show statistical significance of the racial gap in earnings and net worth. We've seen it. We're going to see it more. I mean, with the prior slides, what I shared with you that where we have comparing nation versus the state and the city. Also, it's interesting to find that white and black racial household income and wealth gaps disappear when the reference groups in white with incarceration exposures. This revealed, this is very challenging. The size of the racial gap is relatively similar to incarceration. What we're saying is that sometimes when we look at the data, blacks are penalized sometimes in a similar fashion as a person with incarceration. You see that the data shows that. I think I'm doing good with time, no? 2 minutes? Okay. Yes. So I'm going to show a couple ones, and then I'm going to share the podium with Rafi Garcia to show the decomposition due to the time constraints. But generally speaking about the financial accounts usage in Baltimore. And what I want you to do, what I want you to do, what I want you to do is I want you to, let's proceed this way. Let's first compare blacks with incarceration exposure with blacks with no incarceration exposure. And what we see here in terms of that, for example, bank usage, that for sure there is a significant gap between blacks with incarceration and non-incarceration. And that makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of challenges that arise from incarceration. But then what I would like you to look at this is when we look at black with no incarceration and compared to whites with incarceration. So what you can see, the usage in terms of 76%, 77%, is just about the same. So that really shares a very challenging picture in order to understand the reality of African Americans in terms of interacting with the financial system, no? And then we go across the board. I mean, we come across the other indicators in terms of stocks or retirement. We see the same. It depicts the same distribution, the same challenges, where we see that once again that African Americans with no incarceration, in many instances, were worse than whites with incarceration. Then, excuse me? What is the column check cash? That's when they write checks, they get the ATM, they use the ATMs and so forth. So it's like an indicator for a checking or cash account? Yes, exactly. Well, whether they have a checking or banking account. The other one is when they have an ATM, but there is a difference there that I would like I need to expand a little more on that. Yeah. Then, when we look at tangible business assets, we look at homeowner, automobile ownership, business ownership, and other real estate. You find the same troubling challenges. You find that in many instances, black with no incarceration have the same rates as white with incarceration. And that's exactly what we're pointing out in our findings, that this is troubling as we see across all the different variables that we're looking at, and which always ultimately impact earnings, impact wealth, and intergenerational wealth. So for the sake of time, I'm going to go directly to the regression analysis and the decomposition, and I'm going to bring Dr. Rafi Garcia to the point.
Hi, thank you, Jorge. So I have been tasked to go through this probably in the next 2 minutes. So what we decided to do was to highlight two particular things that we get or we find in the data, and it is the racial gap and the incarceration gap in terms of the effect on wealth. So these are some of the summary statistics. And as you can see here, I want to bring your focus to the earnings and wealth gaps. You can see that there is a significant gaps in terms of earnings and also household income and net worth. And in terms of incarceration gap, you can find also significance, with the exception that at the earning level, there is no significance, as you can see there. So what we decided to do then was to break this down to see, to compare white with incarceration exposure across different groups, blacks with incarceration exposure and blacks without incarceration exposure as well. So the first column here is the whites with no incarceration exposure and how they compare to whites with incarceration exposure, and then blacks with no incarceration exposure and black with incarceration exposure. So you can see here that what we call the penalty, the incarceration penalty, it's reflected in the household income and the net worth as well. And it is significant, but not in earnings for whites. So then we go ahead and compare that to blacks without incarceration exposure. And you can see that the total earnings, there is a gap there, and also for household income and net worth. And then when we compare with incarceration, you can see that overall it's pretty much the same for blacks with no incarceration and black with incarceration. So then we decided, okay, so now we understand that there is a racial gap and also an incarceration gap, but what happens if you compare whites with incarceration exposure to both blacks without and with incarceration exposure to try to tease out the size implications of the penalty? Not only the incarceration penalty, but the racial or discrimination type of the penalty. So here, what we find is that when you compare to whites with incarceration exposure, you find no significance for when compared to blacks with no incarceration exposure and with blacks with incarceration exposure. So that goes to what Jorge was identifying earlier, that the penalty in terms of incarceration and the wealth gap in terms of racial wealth gap are almost similar size in terms of the magnitude of the impact. So what we then decided to do is to say, okay, in order to see if we can explain it only by, if we can explain this relationship, if we compare only, in this case, blacks with no incarceration with blacks with incarceration and see what the difference is. So, and here we find only a penalty in terms of the net worth. Remember that the net worth is calculated with all assets minus all liabilities, and individuals that have, and as Jorge was explaining, that have some type of incarceration exposure are limited in terms of the possibility of building assets, and that's something that we see. So what we decide to do is then implement some of the decomposition, in which we first start by analyzing the differential effect across the assets and liabilities. And what we see, which I thought it was very interesting, is that individuals, both if you study the racial gap and incarceration gap, we do not find any type of significant difference in terms of like the debt that they acquire. So it's kind of like a very similar in terms of like, if you think about home or mortgages and credit cards and student loan and so on and so forth, you don't find significant effect, although the magnitude is large in some situations. But what we do find is significance in terms of how they're building their assets. So the wealth gap that you see is on assets building versus not necessarily that much, or I wouldn't say in terms of like debt has lesser of an impact. So then this brings us to our decomposition. So we did the Oaxaca blinder decomposition within race for earnings, in terms of the earnings, and across this, using the family exposure to incarceration. So you can imagine that now what we're doing is, within that particular same group, whether or not a person belong to a household that has been exposed to incarceration. So in this case, you find that for whites, there is a significant difference when you look at earnings. And in this case, it's 39,000. And when you look at blacks, there is no significant differences. So whether you have been exposed to incarceration or not doesn't have a differential earnings impact for blacks. And we can talk about more in detail as to why do we find that in terms of if you look at job, when you're applying for jobs and setting your wage setting, I would say channels. Right? That could have an implication there, meaning that maybe there's a lot of the racial, it's almost in similar magnitude as the incarceration penalty, as was pointed out earlier. So, and then we do the same thing for net worth. And in this case, we do find a significant difference for both whites and also for blacks. And most of the difference is coming from unexplained, and the way we kind of were able to explain this is that although we're not controlling for certain aspect of wealth, which is, imagine in terms of inheritance. Inheritance is a huge part of how Americans build wealth. So if this is compounded through history, so you can think about in the aspect of how African Americans or US blacks in general have built wealth over time. Compare that to how it's built, for a white American, for example. So you can see that there is more wealth being passed down through generation if you're whites than if you are black, for example. So that's in essence our results. I'm going to let Jorge kind of like talk a little bit about the implications. And
thank you, Rafi. We don't have much time, nevertheless. I don't think we'll be able to entertain any questions. We'll be in the room trying to finish our lunch, so we can talk to you if you have any more questions specifically about any of this report. The reality is shocking. Having said that, what are we doing about these findings? We know we don't want to be one or two generations down the road having the same conversations. The findings are in the report. You can read them. Generally speaking, we see the blacks, African Americans are bearing worse than, with no incarceration, are bearing worse than whites with incarceration. So there's a lot to say about the judicial system. There's a lot to say about biases. There's a lot to say about how we conduct ourselves as a society. So the question is, what do we do about this? And that's why we are here sharing these reports with you. And once again, thanks to the Cook Center and to Dr. Doherty and the team for allowing us this opportunity. But once again, we'll be in the room addressing any questions that you have. I know, unfortunately, we have another presenter coming in 3 minutes, and I'm going to be respectful of his or her time. Thank you.